Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Welcome to All Things Policy. I'm Aditya and I'm joined today by Manoj Kewalramani, the China dude. Welcome, Manoj.
Hey, thanks, Aditya.
It's great to do another episode like this together. And today we're going to talk about China and specifically China's negotiating behavior. Manoj has been following China's negotiating behavior for quite a while, and he's put together some of his thoughts, and we'd like to hear more about it. Manoj, I want to start with the one thing that everyone knows about China's negotiating and its diplomacy, right? Which is its wolf warrior diplomacy. Something everyone talks about, and it shows up every now and then. But I think we've seen less wolf warrior diplomacy perhaps in the last few months. What accounts for the rise and fall of this particular style of diplomacy? And is it also really unique to China?
Right. I mean, I think, the first thing is that for most people engaged in diplomacy or foreign affairs will tell you, former diplomats will tell you that all diplomacy is fundamentally, a product of your domestic politics. So I think that when we think of China's wolf warrior diplomacy or its previous form of diplomacy, which was, I don't know what you would call it, but there were elements of sort of, engaging in becoming a sort of responsible stakeholder from the West perspective in the international order, or, the sort of informal diplomacy with Prime Minister Modi and President Xi Jinping, or, panda diplomacy, economic diplomacy, coercion, whatever. All of it are sort of elements of what's happening within the country and what are the sort of objectives towards which the political establishment seems to be driving the country. I think that it's useful to see that this idea of wolf warriorism has become popular today because of the movie and because of much more media and because of social media and anger on social media that is often expressed because there's a constant narrative contestation that's taking place on social media, and a lot of Chinese diplomats are playing to the gallery of one, essentially, which is Xi Jinping. But this behavior is not new, and just to sort of make that point, I want to quote Jawaharlal Nehru in a note to the Indian ambassador to China in 1959. He had written, and I quote, he's talking about Chinese diplomacy, and he says that recent developments in Tibet have raised difficult problems, not only for India, but for China also, and of course, for Tibet itself. I can appreciate to some extent Chinese attitude, constituted as Chinese are at present. Nevertheless, the regimented and virulent attacks on India in China and their insistence on patent falsehood have surprised and distressed me. Now, this is the important part. It seems to me that Chinese authorities have developed a habit of trying to bully and imagine that offensive language will produce results they desire. It produces exactly opposite results in any self-respecting country. So this is Nehru essentially talking about wolf warrior diplomacy back in 1959, even before the movie was conceived of.
Remarkable.
So therefore, I don't see that this is something that is, new. I think it's part of a toolkit that is devised from time to time, and the toolkit is much broader, I think it's worth anybody who's trying to understand why the Chinese diplomats behave the way they do, whether it's foreign affairs diplomats, whether it's folks in the United Front Department, whether it's folks in military diplomacy, it's useful to think of what are the different tools and what are the different elements of diplomacy that are brought to bear. To that, I think often, one of the faults that we see is that whenever we are talking about a country like China or a country like India, for that matter, which some would describe as civilizational states, people tend to ascribe a lot to ancient strategic culture. So often you will see when something peculiar has happened or a diplomatic bust-up has taken place in a negotiation, you will sort of have people on social media particularly talking about Sun Tzu's XYZ dictum or some other or the fact that Xi Jinping is a Hanfeiser follower. Or say in the case of India's diplomacy, somebody will pull out something from the Arthashastra and draw direct lines and connections. To me, those are sort of very culturally essentialist argument. I mean, I'm not saying that those aspects don't have an impact on strategic thought, but to draw straight lines and say this is where it is inspired from, is a kind of prediction and crystal ball gazing work that I think is not useful.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really struck by what you said about cultural essentialism here, because another point that you've made to us about China's diplomacy is that it's distinctive but not unique, right? And even narratives of cultural essentialism aren't all that unique, right? You have Chanakya to Modi and Plato to NATO and whatnot, right? So, what is it? I'm really curious to know how different, for example, China's diplomacy has been from, say, India's, or other major Asian powers. Are they so different?
I think in some ways they are different, and like you said, there is a distinctive nature to it, but it's not necessarily unique. Why is it not necessarily unique? Is because there are lots of commonalities that you will find in what other countries are doing and what the Chinese are also doing. But there are certain distinctive traits, and those traits are derivative of political culture, ideological sort of systems, and cultural traditions. So, for example, conventionally, for anybody, let's just step back and let's not look at this as diplomacy between states, right? Between nation states. If you are a business person in China, you know one thing, that when you agree upon a contract, firstly, does the legal system sort of justify that contract? Is there a sanctity of the contract within that legal system? And that's important because contracts often tend to be indicative in such systems. They may not be necessarily legally enforceable. And even if they are legally enforceable, the challenge is, does the system function in according to time, requirements, so on and so forth, to be able to arrive at an outcome that the contract would require you to sort of meet? So that's a function of many things, right? It's a function of institutional architecture. It's a function of culture. In some cases, in the case of China, a lot of engagements, particularly that may not be at the highest sort of corporate levels, takes place on what we in India may call vasta. Right, I know a man, I know somebody, and you're my friend, and we'll do it. So there's a lot of trust sort of work in a low trust society. So there are networks of entities that you may trust. In the Chinese context, it's sort of guangxi. It's like who you know, who you don't know, and that allows you to build certain things. Now, if you take that particular element, and this is, I have sort of emphasized where the written word is not significant, right? But there are cases where the written word is significant. For example, if in China you're going to visit a restaurant, and if you look at a sandwich, and the sandwich has certain components, and you don't want one component of it, it's going to be extremely difficult to ask that individual to remove it, because they will say, no, what's written is written, and that's what will be delivered.
Right.
So that's a case where, flexibility may not exist because it is something that's written. On the other hand, like I said, in certain other cases when it comes to contracts, because that the system doesn't necessarily permit the enforceability of contracts, they can be indicative as opposed to necessarily something that is set in stone. Now, if you take this particular aspect and transpose it to something like diplomacy between states, what you will see is that you will see a selective emphasis on the written word. There are times where Beijing will dismiss expressly given commitments. For example, in the case of Hong Kong, what we've seen in the last 4-5 years. Or, for example, in the context of what's happened between India and China in Ladakh, it will dismiss what has been clearly written. Yet at the same time, it will emphasize going back to the Shimla Agreement and things like that. And even before that, going back to documents, and it will emphasize selectively what it wants to emphasize. So there is a selective emphasis on the written word. And that is, there is no moral... There is no sort of rectitude in that, right? You will use it based on what you think. So there's a certain utilitarian approach to that. So that's one part of it. Another example is where it is distinctive but unique is that most diplomacy, in most systems, diplomats tend to have some leeway in terms of how they can function. They may be functioning with a broad brief, and they will try and explore outcomes as best as they can, given their brief. In the Chinese system, and one will notice this for people who've been following the India-China bust up in Ladakh, you will notice this, that across all levels, every individual within the ecosystem tends to repeat the same line. To the extent that it's easy to memorize some of these lines and repeat them, right? Where they'll be talking about the fact that India needs to put the boundary issue in the right context and think about the broader relationship.
Right.
And, this will be repeated ad nauseum by the ambassador, by foreign ministry spokespersons, by their bosses, by the foreign minister, by the head of the Central Foreign Affairs Commission. It will be repeated ad nauseum by the media. And that is essentially line adherence. Unless the individual has the freedom to be able to negotiate on the spot and arrive at compromises, you don't therefore arrive at easy compromises, because the person doesn't necessarily have that freedom. Also, doing this creates a common front, a common position, which is very sort of Marxist-Leninist systems, right? Leninist systems tend to work like that, right? You have a party line which has been laid down.
Right.
Everybody adheres to it. Until the party line moves, nothing moves. And the day it moves, everything moves. And zero COVID was an example of this, right? The day things moved, everything moved. It was like COVID never existed. Long COVID is fiction, all of that. So you will see these peculiarities, right? And the last of which, and there are many in the list that I could point to, but the last of which I will talk to is, that you will see often Chinese diplomats presenting a part of an issue within the context of the whole relationship. So, for example, if it is about Australia investigating Chinese investments because of national security reasons. Now, Australia may have had legislation which looks at all foreign investment. For example, India has legislation. India has a requirement where all investments coming from neighboring countries, have to undergo scrutiny. A bulk of these are from Chinese companies, so therefore most scrutiny is on Chinese companies. The regulation, however, is sort of agnostic to states. From Beijing's point of view, this is not just about investment scrutiny. This is about look at what you're doing to the broader relationship. So you're always focusing on the whole as opposed to the parts, right? And the sum of the parts for Beijing will never be sort of equal to the whole, right? There will always be more elements of it. So there will be areas in which it can give or it may not give, but that doesn't necessarily change the entire policy towards the state. And I think that's something that across the board you see Chinese diplomats talk about, right? They will, even the smallest of issues will be about look at what this is going to do to the entire relationship. And therefore, you need to keep in mind. So there's stakes for you as a foreign diplomat who is probably negotiating, who's probably figuring out trade negotiations,
Right.
is not just about that domain of trade. It's about what am I doing to the whole relationship by doing this, which raises the stakes, makes it a case which is beyond maybe your remit as the trade minister or the commerce minister of a country. And therefore, it sort of makes it much more difficult for you to bargain for tougher deals. And you end up therefore accommodating much more because you may end up having to answer to your colleagues, answer to your leader of your government for other reasons, because your decisions in your domain, because of your priorities, have damaged possibly or created frictions in the broader relationship. So it's quite a smart strategy.
Yeah, that sounds really smart. And it does also just sound like a country trying to protect its interests. And in that sense, it's not all that unique.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But, so Manoj, I want to get to some of the successes and failures, basically, give us examples of how this diplomacy has worked. But before we get to that, I want to understand the style of this diplomacy in the sense of if I'm a diplomat from another country going and meeting a Chinese diplomat, what am I going to experience? Is this Chinese diplomat going to look at me dourly or, sternly? And, is that it? Or do they have a way of wooing people?
I mean, look, it really depends on who you are, what the environment is, what the situation is. You could have the red carpet rolled out for you. You could have things being made extremely difficult for you. I'll give you just two examples at the highest levels, right? When Obama visited China, I think this was 2014, and this is the president of the United States visiting China. And I think that was also for the APEC meeting, but I'll have to check. And if you want to correct me, you can. The Chinese essentially did not send the staircase for him to step down from Air Force One. So he had to step down from the back door and he had to come in. So there was no pomp and protocol, it was a message being sent, right? Likewise, go back to when Trump visited China during his presidency. He was treated to this special tour of the Forbidden City, a special sort of event in the evening. Trump was sort of talking to Xi Jinping about how many thousands of years old is Chinese civilization. So he was treated as royalty. He was treated very special in comparison to, say, Obama. And each of these was to have its own effect based on the outcome that you are looking at. So, yeah, I mean, often this is at the highest levels, but often for, say, other diplomats, it depends on the environment, right? Say, when the Indians were negotiating the agreement on Tibet in the 1950s, the Indian team which visited China was in the country for over 6-7 months. And the Chinese just kept prolonging the discussions because they knew that, it's going to take time. The Indian government is short of time because they have a broader agenda. Nehru has a broader global agenda and he wants to get this done. So you're playing for time and you're doing some of these things where you're pushing the Indian delegation, by simply frustrating them. So there are different ways that you can experience Chinese diplomats. I mean, in Anchorage a couple of years ago when Yang Jiechi and Wang Yi met with Blinken and Jake Sullivan for the dialogue between the Biden administration and the Chinese, you saw these finger-wagging, yelling remonstrations that the Chinese dealt out. You saw the Chinese put out in the media their diplomats carried their cup noodles as opposed to eating the fancy food. So, you see all of this stuff, and the objective of it is to have a broader impact than anything else at home, but also on your interlocutor. You're trying to sort of overawe them in some ways. The flip side of this is, and this can go back to sort of, Mao meeting Edgar Snow, him treating him like royalty and cultivating a friend of China.
Right.
And there are many such friends of China that have been cultivated. The objective is to try and co-opt the individual. So therefore, sort of, I often say that, Chinese diplomacy is very sharply subject matter focused. The goal is the subject matter, but the approach to get there is to focus on the object of the negotiation, which is the interlocutor. Sometimes you want to rattle them, sometimes you want to befriend them, sometimes you want to numb them into a sense of comfort. And this business of befriending is probably the most interesting ones, because the rattling, you sort of get used to it. And, like Nehru said in 59, that, do they think that it'll work? But the befriending one is very, very interesting, because you can do many things, right? At one level, you can, and you hear this in a lot of people, particularly a lot of foreign analysts also tend to have these sort of very essentialist views that if you don't speak or listen to or understand this level of Chinese or this level of discourse, I'm not saying that it's not important. I think it's critical that people understand the language, understand the nuances of the language, all of that. But it's also a case that often the Chinese diplomats also, and Chinese diplomats at all levels, not just in the foreign ministry, tend to use this idea that you lack enough knowledge about us. So learn more about us, and then you will be able to deal with us better. And they tend to use that. So when an individual does have the knowledge and you want to co-opt them, you co-opt them by saying, you truly understand us, and therefore you understand our challenges, you understand our limitations, and therefore you can understand why we can't do X, Y, or Z. So you co-opt that individual as part of your ecosystem. In some cases, that may lead to cultivation of hubris, because you may genuinely believe that my colleagues don't necessarily understand that perspective, and I do, and therefore I am in a uniquely positioned place, and therefore you may end up arguing for that perspective. Now, empathy is a great tool for diplomats to have, but empathy must be measured by your own assessments of your own interests. Right. It must be tempered by that.
Yeah.
So while I completely understand that it's important to have an empathetic understanding, it's important to have an understanding of the other system, it's also important to understand that what the other side is maybe doing with you. So it's useful for diplomats to therefore even think of, and again, at all levels, I'm talking about not just diplomats engaged in foreign affairs work, folks who are at different ministries, who are engaging in economic diplomacy, engaging in military diplomacy, understand the system, develop empathy in terms of what the system's limitations can be, because that may help you arrive at workable solutions. But also keep in mind that your interlocutor from the other side may not necessarily be approaching a negotiation to an issue from a compromise perspective. They may be approaching it from a goal-oriented perspective. And in that, they may leverage your empathy to their end. So it's useful for people to sort of draw that distinction when you step back. And that requires a lot of self-reflection. And therefore, the best diplomats tend to have that, right? They tend to be able to keep their analytical empathy to one side and interest to one side, because if you mix the two, sometimes you can get a good outcome, but not necessarily always, particularly when your relationship is as fractious as the India-China relationship.
That is incredibly fascinating, and my God, it just reminds us what a difficult job diplomacy is. But I want to start putting this in terms of outcomes, successes and failures. So can you talk about some of the big successes that the Chinese have had over, say, the last half century or earlier, and then we can go on to the failures?
I mean, I think, look, the biggest success is obviously the fact that they were able to achieve a normalization of the relationship with the United States. And to that, I mean, for people who are interested in the subject, I would recommend there's a book by R.H. Solomon called Chinese Political Negotiating Behavior. It covers a period from 67 to 84, which deals with the process of normalization. And I think it's really interesting. They talk about some of these strategies, and you can see how those function or don't function even today. So that, I think, is one of the big successes. Obviously, being able to work with the West in the 1990s after the Tiananmen Square massacre to be able to again arrive at some degree of normalization, attract investment, and to essentially convince the West that the language of Marxism and Leninism is simply window dressing, whereas China is fundamentally changing to become perhaps more like them. And I mean, as much as I would credit Beijing with doing that, I would also sort of give part of the credit to the Western leaders and companies for believing, some of that stuff, despite there being enough evidence to the contrary that was not necessarily entirely the case. Is that to say that China did not change? Of course, it changed significantly, but it was never going to give up its system.
Right.
And that, I think, when you look at it, when you look at what they were saying, even at that point of time, it's quite clear that they didn't want to. But does that mean the system didn't need to adapt and evolve? It did need to. Does that mean that the system didn't face pressures and pulls in that process of adapting and evolving? It did. But the idea that the system was paramount and the Communist Party's rule was fundamental to everything was never sort of given up. There was never a talk about becoming multi-party democracy, and it was always whenever there was even suggestions of this, it was rejected. I think the West sort of bought the idea of end of history, and the Chinese let them buy it. So to me, that's a sort of seminal success in allowing the West to sort of believe their own Kool-Aid while you kept on sort of doing what you wanted to do. So to me, I think it's a tremendous success. Entering the WTO was a significant, and again, today we think of it as, oh, the Americans sort of gave it away. I think it's worth thinking that China's process of entering to the WTO, the last few years before that decision was taken, were very, very tricky. I mean, you had the Taiwan Strait crisis, you had the American spy plane crisis, you had a situation with the bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade. So it was not that it was a hunky-dory relationship, yet you persisted, and you used these moments to try and extract what you could from the Americans. I mean, some things, for example, if you read Ambassador Vijay Gokhale's new book of China after the Tiananmen Square, he talks about how American provincial leaders, state leaders, were sort of coaxed, cajoled by Chinese diplomats to try and sort of get a favorable sort of outcome.
Right.
And so to me, those are sort of real big successes. I think the success of being able to manage the fall of the Soviet Union while maintaining your system from the Communist Party's point of view was a big success while attracting foreign investment. And I think from an Indian point of view, getting China and India, the shift in making sure that you get 2 to 3 decades of peace while you could grow and actually grow at that rate that the Chinese did, to me, that was a success for them. So to me, those are some big sort of successes that they've had. In terms of failures, I think if you come more recently, you will see, of course, the management of the relationship with the West. I mean, if your strategic goal is to continue to reach national rejuvenation and you need Western capital technology and you need a favorable external environment, perhaps getting aggressive far too early, is a challenge. I think perhaps misreading the situation after the Lehman Brothers crisis and the financial crisis that we had in 2008, 2009, and to sort of immediately start to turn the sort of knob on assertiveness, which led to a fairly, in some ways, a slow burn counterbalancing reaction.
Yeah.
But the fact that you have actually added fuel to that counterbalancing reaction at each moment over the last decade is, I think, a failure. I mean, the Galwan incident is a classic example. India was moving ahead with the Quad, but it was super cautious. Some people will say that no, this was just a process and India was anyway moving ahead. I mean, I sort of point to the fact that India's decision to keep Huawei ZTE out of the 5G ecosystem did not come until Galwan. Although for a couple of years before that, this conversation was very, very prominent. I mean, we remember presenting a paper in Delhi in 2018, in the summer of 2018. So it took 2 years even after that, and it took something like Galwan for India to take that step. So I think that you've pushed countries much more than you probably needed to. And this is quite a sea change, right? I mean, at one point in time, during Hu Jintao's reign, they were talking about, should we be referring to our rise as rise, or should it be peaceful rise or peaceful development? And you opted for peaceful development at the end because you thought rise was threatening. From that to this, I think there was a misjudgment of the situation in terms of their assessment of American and Western sort of strength. I think and I'll stop with this, but the agreement between Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin last year in February, the joint statement, to me, it is a strategic failure. Xi Jinping committed to a lot more than he needed to. And I can see why he would have thought that. And again, we'd written about this, that at best, he knew what he was getting into. At worst, he got played when Putin attacked Ukraine at the end of February last year. And I think that it's a decision that has locked him into certain trajectories which are difficult to get out of. And as a good negotiator would know, as a good diplomat would know, at the end of the day, you don't want to get locked into difficult spaces, right? You need to be able to have room to wriggle yourself out of it. And I think that that's what they are struggling to do, at least do that, to convince the West of certain things, but to convince, Russia of a certain thing, to convince America of a certain thing. So I think they found themselves in much more of a bind than they needed to be in. And therefore, it's a failure from my point of view that you've strategically given the world a sense that you are, as much as you are criticizing the Americans for, camp mentality, that statement reeks of camp mentality.
Yeah, Manoj, thank you so much. I'll tell you, for the China's behavior over the last 15 years has been perplexing to me as well. And, I think be interesting for us to in the future have a conversation about what exactly are China's calculations, what is driving some of these decisions. But yes, thank you so much for giving us an introduction or a glimpse into how China thinks about its diplomacy, how it actually carries out its diplomacy. And we'd like to talk about that as well much more in the future. Thank you so much.
Cheers. If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.